were this close. You could feel it. Everything was finally aligning: the opportunity, the relationship, the moment you had been working toward for longer than you care to admit. And then something happened. Not from outside, from inside. A decision that made no rational sense. A conversation you started that you knew would go badly. A deadline you let slip. A connection you withdrew from precisely when it was becoming real. A self-destruction so precise, so perfectly timed, that it almost seems intentional. Because it was. Not consciously, not with malice toward yourself, but intentional in the deepest sense, driven by a part of you that operates beneath the reach of your conscious awareness, that has its own logic, its own agenda, its own deeply held convictions about what you deserve and what is safe and what must be prevented from happening. A part of you that Sigmund Freud spent his entire career trying to map, not to condemn, to illuminate. This is the part of you that sabotages, and the reason it keeps winning, the reason the pattern repeats despite your intelligence, despite your awareness, despite your genuine desire to change, is not weakness. It is not lack of discipline. It is not some fundamental flaw in your character. It is because the part of you that self-sabotages is not irrational. It is following a logic so old, so deeply embedded, so thoroughly convinced of its own necessity, that your conscious mind, with all its plans and resolutions and carefully constructed intentions, simply cannot overpower it through force alone. Freud saw this clearly, and what he saw will change the way you understand yourself. Not comfortably, not quickly, but permanently. Let us begin where Freud began, with the uncomfortable proposition that you do not fully know yourself. Not in the way you might casually acknowledge, yes, of course, no one knows themselves completely. In a much more specific and much more confronting sense. Freud proposed that the conscious mind, the you that thinks, plans, narrates, and believes itself to be in charge, is not the primary driver of human behavior. It is, in his famous formulation, the tip of the iceberg, visible, articulate, confident in its own authority, and almost entirely at the mercy of what lies beneath. What lies beneath is the unconscious, not simply forgotten memories or suppressed emotions, though it contains those too, but an entire system of drives, fears, desires, and convictions that have been operating in you since before you had language to describe them, since before you had the cognitive capacity to examine them, since before you understood that what was happening to you as a child was shaping, with extraordinary precision, every significant pattern of your adult life. The unconscious does not think in words. It does not respond to reason. It does not update its beliefs because you have read a self-help book or had an insight in therapy or made a firm resolution on a particular Monday morning. It operates through feeling, through compulsion, through the sudden and seemingly sourceless impulse to do the thing you know you shouldn't, or to not do the thing you know you should. And when you understand this, truly understand it, not just intellectually, but in your body, in the recognition of your own patterns, the question of why you self-sabotage stops being mysterious. It becomes, instead, inevitable. Because you have been playing a conscious game, while the unconscious has been playing an entirely different one, and the unconscious always wins. Freud identified several mechanisms through which the unconscious expresses itself, but, for the purposes of understanding self-sabotage, there is one that matters above all others. He called it the repetition compulsion. The repetition compulsion is one of the most counterintuitive and most important discoveries in the history of psychology. It states, simply, that human beings have a powerful drive to repeat not their positive experiences, not the moments of genuine joy and connection and safety, but their most painful ones, their earliest wounds, their deepest fears, the relational patterns that hurt them most and shaped them most fundamentally. This seems insane. Why would anyone be compelled to repeat what hurt them? Why would a part of you actively seek out the conditions that replicate your earliest suffering? Freud's answer was not comfortable, but it was precise. The repetition compulsion is an attempt at mastery. The unconscious, carrying an unresolved experience, a wound that was never properly processed, a situation that was never brought to completion, a pain that was never given the response it needed, drives the organism back toward a version of that experience in the hope of resolving it this time, of finally getting it right, of finally receiving the response that was withheld the first time. The child who was abandoned goes, as an adult, into relationships with people who are emotionally unavailable, not because they consciously want to be abandoned again, but because the unconscious is still trying to solve the original problem, still trying to finally earn the love that was withheld, still trying to prove, through sheer persistence, that this time it will be different. The person who was told they were too much, too demanding, too sensitive, too complicated, goes on to make themselves small in precisely the moments when being fully themselves would serve them most. Not because they believe in smallness, but because the unconscious remembers the cost of being too much and would rather prevent the success than risk the punishment. The person who grew up in chaos goes on to create chaos in their relationships, in their finances, in their work, not because they want chaos, but because the unconscious only knows how to navigate that particular terrain. Stability feels wrong, unfamiliar, dangerous in a way that cannot be articulated because it has no words, only the vague, persistent sense that something terrible is about to happen, and the driven need to make that something happen on your own terms before it happens to you. This is the hidden reason you self-sabotage, not the reason you tell yourself, I got scared, I wasn't ready, the timing was off, I don't deserve good things. Those are real, but they are surface. Beneath them is something older and more specific. You self-sabotage because your unconscious is trying to protect you from something it learned long ago was dangerous, and because the unconscious does not update its threat assessments based on current reality, it updates them based on the emotional logic of the original wound. Think about the specific shape of your self-sabotage, because self-sabotage is never generic. It is always precisely calibrated to the exact thing you most want and most fear simultaneously. The person who wants love but creates conflict at the moment of genuine closeness. The person who wants success but misses the crucial deadline when the opportunity is real. The person who wants to be seen but withdraws every time someone actually looks. The person who builds something extraordinary and then dismantles it just before completion. Each of these patterns has a specific emotional logic, a specific wound it is trying to manage, a specific threat it has identified, intimacy, visibility, success, completion, and a specific strategy it deploys to prevent that threat from materializing. The strategy is self-sabotage, and it is extraordinarily effective because it works. It prevents the thing you fear. Every time you destroy the relationship before it becomes real, you successfully avoid the intimacy that terrifies you. Every time you miss the deadline, you successfully avoid the exposure of being truly seen in your work. Every time you withdraw just as someone reaches for you, you successfully avoid the vulnerability of being held and possibly dropped. The unconscious does not care that in preventing what it fears, it is also preventing what you want. It cares about survival, and survival, in the emotional logic of the original wound, required exactly this. Freud introduced a concept that most people find deeply uncomfortable when they first encounter it. He called it the death drive, or more precisely, Thanatos, the counterpart to Eros, the life drive, where Eros moves toward connection, growth, pleasure, and creation. Thanatos moves toward dissolution, repetition, and return to a state of rest. In its extreme form, it manifests as self-destruction. In its everyday form, the form that most of us experience, it manifests as self-sabotage. The death drive is not a desire to die. It is a pull toward the known, toward the familiar, toward the emotional state that, however painful, feels like home. Because the unconscious does not distinguish between what is good for you and what is familiar to you, it distinguishes only between what it knows and what it does not. And what it does not know, success, safety, genuine love, sustained happiness, registers not as desirable, but as threatening, not because these things are actually dangerous, but because the unconscious has never learned to trust them. This is why people who grow up in painful environments often find themselves unable to sustain the good things when they finally arrive. Why the relationship that is genuinely healthy feels wrong in a way they cannot explain. Why the success that is genuinely deserved immediately triggers the impulse to undermine it. Why happiness itself can feel like a warning sign, because in the emotional logic of the original environment, good things were always followed by something worse. And the unconscious, loyal to that logic, tries to get ahead of the crash by engineering it first. You are not broken. You are running a program that was written in conditions that no longer exist. And the program, however outdated, is executing with perfect fidelity. There is another layer to this that Freud identified, and that is essential to understanding self-sabotage in its most painful form. He called it the superego. Where the unconscious drives push upward toward expression, the superego pushes back, not with conscious reason, but with shame. with guilt, with an internal voice of judgment so powerful and so relentless that it can prevent any genuine success from being sustained. Because the superego does not want you to succeed, not because it hates you, but because it has a very specific idea of who you are and what you deserve. And that idea was formed in the earliest years of your life, in the crucible of your first relationships, by voices that have long since gone silent except inside you, where they continue to speak with absolute authority. The person whose superego carries the voice of a critical parent will sabotage their own achievements, not because they don't want to succeed, but because some part of them, very deeply, believes they don't deserve to. That success is dangerous. That rising too high will invite punishment, the withdrawal of love, the accusation of arrogance, the reminder of their unworthiness that the critical voice has always been ready to deliver. The person whose superego carries the voice of an environment that communicated in 1,000 small and large ways that they were not enough, not smart enough, not good enough, not lovable enough will undermine themselves precisely at the moments when they are about to prove that voice wrong. Because proving it wrong is not only joyful, it is terrifying. Because if the voice is wrong about this, it might be wrong about everything. And the self that was built around that voice, the identity constructed from those early communications, would have to be dismantled and rebuilt from scratch. That dismantling is necessary, but the unconscious fears it more than almost anything, and so it engineers the sabotage that keeps the voice intact, the failure that confirms what the voice always said, the self-destruction that maintains the only coherent self it has ever known. Now I want to talk about what this actually looks like in practice, because it is one thing to understand the theory, it is another to recognize your own pattern in it, and recognition is where everything begins. Think about the last time you self-sabotaged, not the story you told yourself about it afterward, the actual sequence of events. What happened just before? What were you on the verge of? What did the moment before the sabotage feel like in your body? For most people, there is a distinctive physical signal, a tightening, a restlessness, a sudden and inexplicable impulse to do something, check your phone, start a fight, make an impulsive decision, withdraw, disappear. It feels like urgency without a clear object, like anxiety without a clear cause, like the ground shifting slightly beneath your feet even though nothing external has changed. That signal is the unconscious activating. It has identified a threat, success, intimacy, visibility, completion, whatever your particular wound has designated as dangerous, and it is preparing its response, which is sabotage, preventive, precise, devastating sabotage. Freud believed that the path through this begins with making the unconscious conscious, not through willpower, not through positive thinking, not through forcing different behavior while the same unconscious logic continues to run beneath it, but through the slow, patient, often uncomfortable work of bringing the hidden into the light, of giving a name and a history to the patterns that have been operating in the dark. When you can see the pattern, when you can say, I am doing this because a part of me learned a long time ago that this was how to survive, something shifts, not immediately, not completely, but at the level where the pattern actually lives. Because the pattern is not rational, but it is responsive to being seen. The unconscious, when it is acknowledged rather than fought, begins to loosen its grip, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. There is something Freud wrote that I want you to carry with you. He said that unexpressed emotions will never die. They are buried alive and will come forth later in uglier ways. Your self-sabotage is not ugliness. It is an emotion that was never able to be expressed in its original form, a fear that was never able to be spoken, a wound that was never able to be received by someone capable of holding it. And so, it found another way, a more indirect way, a way that protects the original wound from exposure by keeping you just far enough from the situations that would expose it. Understanding this does not mean accepting the sabotage as permanent. It means understanding it as a communication. Your self-destructive behavior is not a character flaw. It is a message from a part of you that has been trying, in the only language it knows, to tell you something important about what happened and what it cost. The question is whether you are finally ready to listen, not to indulge the pattern, not to excuse it, but to listen to what it is trying to protect, to turn toward the wound with something the wound never received when it was first created: genuine attention, genuine curiosity, the willingness to ask, what happened here? and to stay in the presence of the answer without immediately trying to fix or flee. This is where the actual work begins, and I will not pretend it is easy or quick or comfortable. Freud was not a comfortable thinker. He did not offer easy reassurances or simple methods. What he offered was something rarer and more lasting, an honest map of the interior, a way of seeing yourself that, once genuinely adopted, changes the quality of everything. When you begin to see your self-sabotage not as failure but as communication, you stop being at war with yourself. You stop treating the pattern as an enemy to be defeated and start treating it as a part of yourself to be understood. And in that shift from war to understanding, something becomes possible that was not possible before. You can make a different choice, not because you have forced the unconscious into submission, but because you have finally understood what it was trying to say. Because you have finally given the original wound the acknowledgement it was seeking. Because you have finally recognized that the strategy that kept you safe then is the strategy keeping you small now. And small is no longer acceptable, not because you have decided to be brave, but because you have seen too clearly what the alternative costs, the relationships you have destroyed, the opportunities you have walked away from, the versions of yourself that you have dismantled before they could fully exist. You did those things to survive, that is true, and it deserves compassion, not condemnation. But survival is not the goal anymore. The goal is to live, fully, presently, without the unconscious running interference every time something real is within reach. Freud believed that the aim of psychoanalysis, and by extension, the aim of this kind of deep self-examination, was not to create a perfect human being. It was to transform neurotic suffering into ordinary unhappiness. This might sound like a modest goal, but it is, in practice, a radical one. Because neurotic suffering, the suffering generated by the unconscious patterns playing out their ancient logic in your current life, is suffering that does not belong to you. It is the suffering of wounds that were never yours to carry, of voices that were never yours to obey, of a threat assessment that was accurate then and is catastrophically outdated now. To transform that suffering into ordinary unhappiness, the ordinary difficulty of being human, of loving and losing and failing and trying again, is to finally live your own life. Not the life determined by what happened to you, the life determined by who you actually are beneath all of that, who you have always been, waiting patiently beneath the patterns, beneath the protection, beneath the sabotage. That person is still here. They never left. They have simply been kept safe, too safe, as it turns out, by a part of you that loved you in the only way it knew how. It is time to thank that part, and to let it rest, and to finally, with full consciousness and full permission, allow yourself to have what you have always deserved. Write in the comments, "I am ready to stop." Let's see how many people are finally done running the old program. And do not stop here. The next video goes deeper. You need to keep going.